Hi, musicians. Today, we're going to be hearing the story about two best friends. Their names are Mr. Wiggle and Mr. Waggle. Mr. Wiggle lives in a white house, and Mr. Waggle lives in a yellow house. And they have 3 hills between their houses. Let's count them. 1, 2, and 3. Well, one morning, Mr. Wiggle woke up in his white house, and he thought to himself, today I'm going to visit my best friend in the world, Mr. Waggle. And so, musicians, I'd like you to use your fingers and maybe even your voices to trace the path between Mr. Wiggle and Mr. Waggle's house with me. Mr. Wiggle went up the hill and down the hill, and up the hill and down the hill, and up the hill and down the hill. And when he got to Mr. Waggle's house, he knocked on the door. And Mr. Waggle opened the door and said, Mr. Wiggle. And Mr. Wiggle said, Mr. Waggle. And they gave each other a big hug. And they spent the day together baking cookies and playing soccer. But then it was time for Mr. Wiggle to go home. So he gave Mr. Waggle a big hug goodbye and get ready to trace the path again. Mr. Wiggle went up the hill and down the hill, and up the hill and down the hill, and up the hill and down the hill. And he got home and he went to sleep. Well, the next morning, Mr. Waggle in his yellow house woke up and thought to himself, today I'm going to visit my best friend in the world, Mr. Wiggle. And he left his house, and musicians, get ready to trace the path with your fingers and maybe also your voice. Mr. Waggle went up the hill and down the hill, and up the hill and down the hill, and up the hill and down the hill. And when he got to Mr. Wiggle's house, he knocked on the door. And Mr. Wiggle opened the door, and Mr. Wiggle said, Mr. Waggle. And Mr. Waggle said, Mr. Wiggle. And they shared a big hug, and they spent the day having a picnic and playing jump rope. Well, now it was time for Mr. Waggle to go home, so he gave Mr. Wiggle a big hug goodbye, and he went up the hill and down the hill, and up the hill and down the hill, and up the hill and down the hill. And when he got home, he went to sleep and had a dream about his wonderful day with Mr. Wiggle. Well, the next day, Mr. Wiggle woke up in his white house and thought to himself, I'm going to surprise Mr. Waggle today with a visit. And Mr. Waggle woke up at the same time and thought to himself, I'm going to surprise Mr. Wiggle today with a visit. So they both left their houses, and now, musicians, you're going to have to start at both of their houses, and you're going to have to trace their paths at the same time. We're going to see where they meet. And they both went up the hill and down the hill and up the hill. And they met in the middle at the top of the hill. And they had a great day singing songs and drawing pictures and eating ice cream. But then it was time for them to go home. So they gave each other big hugs. And then from the top of the hill where they met, they went down the hill and up the hill and down the hill. And they both went into their houses, and they went to sleep, and they had wonderful dreams about each other. And they lived happily ever after as best friends. Great job, friends. I hope, musicians, that you were able to trace the path up and down in the story with Mr. Wiggle and Mr. Waggle. Thanks, everybody.